Oh, how good it is to see you. For the last 16 months, I've been standing in this pulpit, missing you and trying to imagine you. As I prepared and delivered my word, I found myself wondering how you've been doing, how you've been navigating the pandemic, where you are, and even where you're listening to the services. Occasionally, the text of this 42nd Psalm has made its way through my head. Like a deer crying for water, my soul cries for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, the living God. My tears have been my food day and night. I'm ever taunted with, where is your God? When I think of this, I pour out my soul. How I walked with the crowd, moved with them, the festive throng to the house of God with joyous shouts of praise. The text is very old. It dates back at least 2,500 years. It contains two ancient sentiments, both of which, if you're anything like me, you might have struggled with in these last difficult months. The first is a cry, a thirst, a longing for connection with the living God. The second is a belief that that longing can be met sometimes among the festive throng in the house of God, where voices are joined together with joyous shouts of praise. But before I continue, can I get, right now, maybe a bit of a joyous shout of praise? Let the world know how happy you are to be here. Clap. Did that feel good? I hope it did. Returning to the psalmist's text, we find the words, the living God. Now, as Unitarian Universalists, I recognize that some of you might trip over the words, the living God. So here, as I often do, I invite you to think of Forest Church's adage, God is God, not God's name. It's our name for that which is greater than all and yet present within each. God is but a symbol. If you like, you could substitute the word God for something that is more meaningful for you. You could speak instead of the experience of connection with one of our hymn's names, the chorus of life. Or maybe instead of what our Unitarian Universalist sources name, transcending mystery and wonder. Whatever language you choose to use, it is a basic tenet of our religious tradition and a core claim of the psalmist that we humans long for connection with something greater than ourselves. Put differently, we're social creatures. We're dependent on a creation and communities far larger than ourselves for our very existence. The Jewish theologian Martin Buber named this dynamic simply when he wrote of how every person, every I requires a you to know themselves. His words, I require a you to become. Becoming I say you. All actual life is encounter. I require you. Life is encounter. Thirsting after a connection with something greater than ourselves. Shall we admit that one of the greatest difficulties of the pandemic and these last months has been the sense of isolation and disconnection that so many of us have felt? I've been lonely. I've been isolated. There were times when I felt the little world of the pandemic collapsing in on me. When I saw no one in person for days on end except for my son, my partner, and her son. Like a deer crying for water. Those were hard days. The circumscribed rhythm of the pandemic prescribed physical distancing beat me like a drum with its incessant relentlessness. Time felt formless. Days were not linear. They had no clear beginnings and distinct endings. Instead, they felt like unmoored gray lumps, indistinct and indistinguishable from each other. If all actual life is encounter, then some weeks there did not seem to be very much of it. My soul thirsts. I've spent much of the last 16 months thirsting for connection with community. The ancient psalmist describes a basic human need, a need that is as strong as the need for each of us to have, on a hot day like today, a cool drink of water. It is not a need that disappeared when the scribe's ink dried on that ancient parchment. I detect a similar need in Patricia Spears Jones's words, been running through these streets, looking for a coolness. Been running through these streets looking for your face, that soft smile. I've been thirsty so long, my mouth feels like a parchment. Have you been thirsty for community and connection? Does what I've described seem similar to your own experience? Feel free to answer yes if it does. There is a gathered community in this sanctuary again. Those of you who are present with me can respond to the sermon. You can offer up a yes or an amen, or a clap, or a that's right. You can either offer up another joyous shout of praise. Today is a good day. Preaching to a congregation that has been absent in body but present in spirit has been a difficult and different experience. In truth, I'm not even sure much of what Reverend Scott and I and our occasional guests have done for these last months even qualifies as preaching. Sermons, as I understand them, are conversations between multiple partners. There's the minister, there's the congregation, there's our shared tradition, and there's whatever is greater than all and yet resides within each, that thing that we long to connect with. A good sermon is a polyphonic experience in which the minister just contributes their part. Manuals on preaching and scholars of homiletics, which is the fancy word for the study of preaching, are unanimous on this point. One describes what I'm doing right now as a partnership between clergy and laity. Another argues, a sermon is not a sermon without a congregation. A good sermon begins with the people in the pews, a third enjoins. The people in the pews. I've spent a great deal of time over these last months, almost certainly too much of the indistinguishable days, wondering if what I was doing when we recorded the service was preaching. The people in the pews were not here. Since March of 2020, I've even questioned whether I was actually serving as a minister. I had a joke with the staff, which, like most of my jokes, is not actually that funny. Ever since we took our services online. When people ask me, I would tell the staff, when people ask me, what do you do? I no longer respond, I'm a minister. Instead, I tell them, I'm the executive producer of a television show. Like I said, it's not really a funny joke. When I think of this, I pour out my soul. How I walked with the crowd, moved with them, the festive throng to the house of God, with joyous shouts of praise. Whatever it is that I've been doing, whatever I'm doing now, is certainly preaching. While some of you are watching this at home, a good number of you are sitting in the pews again, right in front of me. After the service has ended, you will tell me whether or not my word moved you. I'll stand on the breezeway and talk with more than a few of you about your worship experience in your lives. You'll share something of what has passed, and I will listen. And in my listening, I will be informed about what I should talk with you about when we regather next Sunday. It is so good to have you here. I'm so glad that we are able to resume the long-established rhythms of the dialogue that is congregational life. The philosopher William James may have defined religion as the feelings, acts, and experiences of individuals in their solitude in relation to the divine, but he was wrong. Religion these last difficult months have made clear to me, is something that we do together. I am not a minister without you. You are not a congregation without each other. We are not Unitarian Universalists by ourselves. We are Unitarian Universalists together. We are Unitarian Universalists together. The crowd, the festive throng, the house of God. I'll expand a little more on the collective nature of our endeavor momentarily, but first a slight digression. Those of you trained in philosophy may think that I am not being fair to James in my characterization of his definition of religion. After all, you might point out that he goes out of his way to clarify that he only talks about personal religion, pure and simple. I propose to ignore the institutional branch entirely, he tells us. But these last months have taught me that such an exercise is impossible. The separation between my personal experience of the divine and the religious organization is not neat and an easy one to make. There's no joining point that can be separated by an intellectual knife and then worried further apart. Instead, there is just the single object. I require you to become, to recall Buber. We are Unitarian Universalists together. If there are any devoted students to James out there, you might reply to all this by saying that I still don't get the point of his text. For he wants us to understand that the personal experience of the divine, what our Unitarian Universalist sources call that experience of transcending mystery and wonder, is the foundation upon which the entire religious enterprise rests. The founders of every church owed their power originally to the fact of their direct personal connection with the divine, he informs us. This was the case, he writes, with the superhuman founders, Christ, Buddha, Muhammad, peace be upon his name, all the originators, he tells us. Poke at that list, and I think the argument starts to fall apart. For each of these superhuman founders did not have their personal experiences in a vacuum. They had their experiences of the divine in dialogue, in conversation with a tradition, which is to say the cultures and teachings of a religious community, and then their collective disciples with whom they reinterpreted that tradition. Jesus was a Jewish teacher whose teachings come from his reimaginings of Judaism. His last words on the cross attest to this, being but a fragment of the 22nd Psalm. The Buddhist understanding of nothingness does not rest upon nothing at all. It has firm foundations in concepts articulated in old ancient texts and in that tradition called Hinduism, which he reinterpreted to give us his teachings about nirvana and how to achieve it. Read the Quran and you will see that Islam's founder did not invent his religion whole cloth. He rooted it in Jewish and Christian teachings of the divine and in their ancient texts. Jerusalem is a holy city for Muslims, and Jesus is held by Islam to have been a great prophet. What is unique about each of the people of James's list is not that they invented something anew or from their direct personal experience that they had alone. It is that in times of crisis, they each reinterpreted existing tradition to meet the needs of the hour. Consider Jesus, a colonized person suffering under the brutality of the Roman Empire. He lived during a time of profound crisis. Prophets and revolutionaries arose throughout ancient Israel, urging their people to throw off the yoke of the oppressor. Dissidents were tortured, crucified, fed to lions, and forced to fight to the death as gladiators. The world must have seemed as if it was coming apart. In this world that was coming apart, the teachings of the priests and the practices of the temple must have seemed insufficient. Jesus certainly thought that they were, and so he reinterpreted his tradition. His God, his understanding of the divine, remained the God of his ancestors. But the time of crisis led him to reimagine what it meant to be faithful and to have a personal connection to the divine. He did not do this in the absence of institutional religion. He did it in dialogue, in conversation with it. Now, I could stand here and point to all the places within the gospel texts and the Christian New Testament reference the almost 20 passages where Jesus cites the Hebrew Bible or describes many arguments with the leaders of Jewish sects, but that would take more time than we have. My claims are simple. Our thirst for connection with the divine is something we are best equipped to say together, and that in times of crisis we are called to reinterpret our traditions. Like a deer crying for water, my soul cries for you, O God, the festive throng, to that house of God with joyous shouts of praise. We are Unitarian Universalists together. Maybe another joyous shout of praise here. Amen. This thing called religion, this connection we seek with the divine, this pursuit of what I have in the past, named the resurrection of the living, the waking up to the world as it is something I do not do by myself. This truth has been one of the many reasons why these past months have been so hard. To be our human, our psalmist and our poet both suggest, is to thirst for connection. Again, Patricia Spears Jones. Been dancing on a dream too long, and found myself lost in this desert. No lovers tonight, not one. No rain for days. There's been no metaphorical rain for a long time. The pandemic has made many of us very thirsty for connection to the larger human community. The spark of the divine within each of us burns ever brighter when we gather. The sermon, the act of worship, is not my words alone. It is something that occurs when we have all congregated. There is something, a lesson that has been impressed upon me during this pandemic. The collective nature of our communion, that act of being together, which we call religious, has been one of the things I have been woken up to in these last challenging months. What about you? What have you woken up to during these apocalyptic times? You might recall at the beginning of the pandemic, I offered, shall I call it a sermon, a pre-recorded video performance, a virtual worship service. Anyway, at the very beginning of the pandemic, at the start of these strange days, I offered the observation that we are living in apocalyptic times. The Greek word apocalypsis means to unveil, to disclose, to reveal, the theologian Catherine Keller teaches us. And in March of 2020, the world of the before times ended. Right now, a new world, the world of the after times, is being born. The pandemic still rages, and here I must observe that the only way to bring it to abeyance is for as many people as possible to get vaccinated. Anyway, the pandemic still rages, but life is starting to return to something that it resembled in the before times. The resemblance is but a similitude. No matter what we might think, one of the truths of the hour can be found in Yeats's words. All changed, changed utterly. All changed, changed utterly. In these apocalyptic times, much has been unveiled, disclosed, and revealed. Indeed, so much has been revealed that it would be difficult and distressing to list it all. It is impossible now, if it was ever possible before, to deny that the naked and aggressive white supremacy that pervades much of the United States. The events of January 6th and all that led up to them and all that came after refuse any honest person that, nor can the deep interconnection of each to all be ignored. And that is prevented by the worldwide spread of the virus amongst us. We cannot pretend that democracy is other than in crisis. We cannot reject the idea that capitalism is based upon the exploitation of what those who have come to be called essential workers, which is another phrase for the working classes. We cannot. Well, let me pause here and ask you this question. What has the pandemic revealed to you? What has been unveiled, made visible, that was hidden before? I invite you to ponder that question in the coming weeks and months. My tears have been my food day and night. I'm ever taunted with, where is your God? How I walked with the crowd, moved with them, the festive throng to the house of God. Two things have been revealed to me during these difficult months, these strange things. Two things I have woken up to, and now that are being resurrected, made anew, alive again for me, are this. First, this thing we call Unitarian Universalism, this thing we call preaching, this thing we call religion is something that we do together. As James Luther Adams observed, a communion like ours requires a place of meeting in which we can gather and in which we must maintain. A note of appreciation here is required, of course, to all of those who contributed to our Reopening Readiness campaign. Without the ability to, as our hymn from earlier said, gather the Spirit, we are something other than a congregation, something other than a religious community. Here, of course, we could reflect upon exactly what it has meant for us to be a primarily virtual communion for these last months. But the word of the hour is not about what we have been doing during these strange days, but hopefully rather about what we are now upon embarking. Second, the apocalyptic revelations in these past months require us to reimagine everything. All changed utterly. We have a choice. We can stay awake to all that has been revealed, all that has been made visible, or we can go back to sleep and pretend, and it will be a pretense, that the world can somehow return to what it was in the before times. Here in worship for the next months, as the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston, we'll be offering you a chance to reimagine the world. How might, as we gather the Spirit, we make our congregation anew, transform ourselves, find new ways of being that will empower us, individually and collectively, to reimagine and rebuild as we live through the ongoing apocalypse that will be the pandemic's aftertimes. These questions are the things that we can best pursue together. I hope you will engage with them and with me and this congregation as we find ourselves in what our closing hymn so eloquently names the Great Turning. Let us share the wisdoms of the hymn's words in a moment. But before we do, I invite you one last time to help me conclude this sermon with joyous shouts of praise.